Okay, here we go. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thanks for being here. This is going to be a bit kind of an interesting go show in a different way. Number one, for its translations. This is translated from Western scholarship. And there's a tendency always in the Western scholarship, whether it's done on purpose or not, and at times it has been done. It's well documented that at sometimes Western scholars in the 19th century and in the 20th century would influence their translations by their own desire to minimize the importance of Buddhism or the differentiation of Buddhism from their religious upbringings and their religious sphere of reference, their worldview, the idea of an omnipotent creator, and that everything is somehow designed by something other than ourselves, or influences outside of our own conscious mind, is very much a strong theme in all of Western religion, and indeed in Asian religions as well. Everything from folklore to modes of belief systems. They're everywhere in the world. It's a feature of samsaric human identity, right? When you boil down religions objectively, they tend to really center around our own egotistical version of body, this human existence, and how we can either eternalize it, make it somehow a soul or a continuing thing, and most religions end up somehow beating us up for just being here until we can finally get released and go to this magical place. Those themes of religion are in various degrees inculcated into the cultures, so that from the moment you're born, you're barraged from TV, from radio, from parents, from brothers and sisters, from our environment, from our friends, from our teachers, this idea. And it's a real pollution of our of our conscious abilities and our perceptions. And so many people, whether Western or not, or Eastern, when they endeavor to study Buddhism and certainly take on the mantle of translation, either can't help themselves or actively infuse contradictory information to what Buddhism is actually teaching in order to validate their own worldview. Excuse me. And there's also a more insipid tendency, especially in lay organizations, but even in very strict sects of Buddhism, that when introducing Buddhism to a Western audience or a more global audience, tend to use the rhetoric of those neo-religious tendencies and cultures to familiarize or to give them an entry point that feels less foreign and more comfortable to the Western mind, and that makes this grand assumption that everyone in the West is polluted by that same kind of magical thinking, right? Unfortunately, this has the effect of really misguided Buddhist teaching and information, and it's one of the reasons that I started this channel, because one of my fervent wishes is to strip that kind of misinformation out, not to impose my own agenda, or my own religious upbringings or whatever that might be, but my entire mission is to get to the root of the matter, to really understand Shakyamuni's enlightenment and the teaching of the Dharma without polluting it with these outside forces that obfuscate just the simple clarity of Buddhism. And I'm not a perfect being, but I try to catch myself as much as I can. And certainly the more I study Buddhism over the last 40 years or so, the more it becomes obvious. I apologize, something's in my throat. The more obvious it becomes, and I think it will for you too, that when I read translations of Buddhist writings and thoughts, sometimes it's very subtle, and I won't catch it until I've reread something several times over years, and oh, there it is again, right? Invariably, though, and I credit Shakyamuni and Buddhist scholars within Buddhism for this, in repeating that study is essential, and that we study, more to the point, broadly all of the scholarship. Because when we do that, it's not just a matter of understanding how the scholarship works and how it builds and all of that, but it forces us to confront our insights. And when, for myself, when I've had insights, oftentimes I'll go back and reread things because why didn't I see that before? Why was I stuck on perceiving this way? And invariably what I'll find is that I've had to reread stuff that has been influenced poorly. And once you get it, it's very obvious to see. But until you get it, it influences you, and it confounds your understanding sometimes. So I encourage you, in saying this, that if you find through your study, as you're practicing, certain aspects of Buddhism that for you in your mind, they don't seem to jive, they don't seem to, you don't feel comfortable with them, whatever it is, there's some sort of malaise around them, I will guarantee you that a large percentage of the time, that's simply because of the way it was articulated and your own vestiges of thinking are just jumping right in to fill the voids, and it's preventing you from seeing clearly what is being indicated. So again, that's why I do these videos. That's why I wander around in them a lot of times, because I want to explore my own thinking as I unwind these tendencies from the translations to obfuscate the actual meaning. Buddhism, and Shakyamuni has said this many times, we use words to communicate. Now my nose is going to itch. We use words to communicate, and words are very amorphous things. They're not, I mean, the English language is probably one of the more minute, staccato little devices to communicate with specificity. And I say that because when you look back at Sanskrit, which was more an auditory language, inflections and the sing-songy of pronunciations were just as valued, if not more, than the actual words themselves. Language has come a long way in its development from very conceptual and delivery-oriented communication to something that tries to be more mathematical and precise in its didactic reasonings. But even so, we often find it, as I stumble myself, to come up with words or formations of words that will accurately represent a thought. And even if we nail that down to where we're 99% satisfied, the way it's heard from those, because what we're dealing with is our worldview. That's our filter for everything that we ingest, right? From experience to words. So Buddhism is very much about untangling that worldview. We use words to help us, direct us, and suggest us in certain directions. But ultimately, it's the meaning of the teaching that's critical. And the meaning is something that you experience. It's not in the words. So ultimately, that effort is very unique to you. It's a very individual thing. And Shakyamuni repeated that very many times. Itai Doshin even indicates it, many in body, one in mind. It's a worldview that we need to adjust. It's our perception of the world and our life within the worldview that we have that is the Dharma, or our road to the Dharma, the Buddha way, right? So, this Gosho, Hell is the Land of Tranquil Light, obviously, no matter how you interpret that title, is an allusion to the duality of our samsaric experience. That when we suffer, we tend to let that suffering, whatever it is, wash over us and take control of our perception of our worldview again. Everything seems to justify that negativity. And yet, if we look more profoundly and more detached from those influences, we can see in them the brilliance and the awesome nature of the life process, which is an amazing process. And that amazement is the tranquil light of understanding that lifts us from that dark place, right, of hell. This is Western thinking. Dark, black, it's our color of death. It's our color of oppression and evil, right? The cowboy with the black hat is the evil guy, and the cowboy with the white hat is the good guy, right? But in other cultures, white is the color of death, and white is the color of a different sort of it. It's not evil, but it's and white is used as a letting go, a brilliance, a light, right? It's just used in different ways but suffice it to say, multicolored existence, right? So this Gosho is a Gosho written to a woman who's lost her husband. So she's obviously grieving. So what we're going to read here is a tendency to look at this fallacy of eternity. And this is why I'm cautioning you in the first place. Because though it's in the common vernacular, and Nichiren is talking to a lay believer and trying to give some compassion, some level of understanding and guidance to this woman who's lost her husband. And you have to also understand, this is back in the 13th century when losing your husband meant an entirely different thing than losing your husband today. It's still a loss, don't get me wrong. But the implications of a woman without her man in the 13th century, in a shogunate authoritarian government, there's a big uphill climb for this woman, right? So there's a tremendous loss of security and exegesis over her own life, power, if you will. So he's trying to console, as well as he's trying to educate and get her to understand this process of her life and her grieving for her and her children with the loss of her husband. So I'm sure that even if we read the early Japanese actual writings and understood culturally the way he was communicating with her, we're still dealing with an overlapping or overarching philosophical cant, if you will, from the Western religious interpretation of this letter. So I'm trying to, I don't want to rewrite it like I think it should have been written, because I don't want to do that. I don't know Nichiren personally, other than through Daimoku and the mandala, right? So how he would have spoken to this woman, I don't know. So I'm going to read this translation and rely on the actual truth of the matter coming through this scholarship. But I'm also recognizing that this scholarship is somewhat tainted because it was written by a Western perspective. So that's all. Look at how many words it took for me to get that out. I still don't feel like I accurately communicated it, but with that, let's go into this. And maybe if something jumps out at me, I'll point it out, okay? So he begins. I have received your offering of various articles. Nothing would please me more than to know that you have communicated with the late Ueno, but I know that that is impossible. So that's interesting, because Ueno is the husband. And he's saying right off the back, I know that it's impossible that you've been talking to him. So that's a very real-world Buddhist understanding. But listen to how that gets kind of watered down. So right after he says, but I know that that is impossible, because he's dead. Unless it was in a dream, it is unlikely that you have seen him. So he's allowing for her mental conjuring of it. And this is what we do. This is samsaric. So that's valid, right? Unless it was an illusion, how could you have seen him? Surely your late husband is in the pure land of Eagle Peak, listening and watching over this Saha world day and night. Now, that's where it gets confusing. So yes, he's at Eagle Peak. So what does that mean? Let's take that apart for a moment. Eagle Peak is a reference we've heard many times already, and it's a reference to our Buddhahood, our Buddha-ness, our enlightenment, right? So it's not another place. It's a mental and life condition, because mind, body are one. Mind, body includes the universe, the earth, the society, the community, the family, the right. Body is physical reality, and mental is spiritual reality. Although that word is right, it's got a lot of charisma to it. But let's make that division so that you and I are clear, right? In Buddhism, all of skillful means and expedient means and skillful devices is all about describing and trying to embrace the functions of mind that we have. Not brain, but our thinking itself. And that thinking itself is not physical. So we can give it the label of spiritual, but it's not other. It's spiritual within. It's the functioning of our perceptive existence, right? Which is married and undivorceable from this physical selfness, which includes where we live, the land that we know, the country, etc., etc., all the physical manifestations we experience, right? That's body. So this is why when we read in Buddhism of the pure land or the Dharma body of Buddha, or our Buddha, our Buddha-ness, there is a physical reality that we address because we experience our Buddhahood as physical beings. But it is a psychological, a mental construct to which we analyze and experience everything. So when he says their husbands at Eagle Peak, what he's saying is that he obviously is no longer physical. he exists only in the mental, spiritual sense. And that's no longer a he as an individuated physical self. It's a mental he in your perceptive self. So obviously she still communicates with him, but only him as he occurs in her mental construct. Do you follow? So, we hear this in the West as he or she still exists in our hearts, right? So this is, in Buddhism, we recognize that people, especially close relationships that we have with people or things, still exists in a sense in our spiritual, in our mind, our mental construct of our worldview, right? Memories. But memories that we continue to build a relationship on. So that may sound odd, but when someone passes away, they're in body, they don't exist anymore. They only exist in the mind, but not their mind, not the mind, but our minds, those who knew them. And we continue to build understanding of those personages through our own perception, which we always have, but we're more confronted with it when their physical, actual self is gone, dissipated, right? So, saying that he's watching over the Saha world day and night isn't a reference really to the deceased husband. It's a reference to the deceased husband in her mind. Follow? You, his wife, he continues, and your children have only mortal senses, so you cannot see or hear him. But be assured that you will eventually be reunited on Eagle Peak. This is a really careful way of saying you're going to die too. And so you will experience what he experienced as he left this body. You're not going to some eternal place, but there's a kind of a finite moment when you die, isn't there? And that moment is something we all will eventually share. Okay? Going on. The men with whom you have exchanged marriage vows over the course of all your previous lifetimes must outnumber even the grains of sand in the ocean. Now that this is where I suspect translation is having difficulty with this concept. If you'll remember, and I've pointed this out oodles of time. Oh, there's a word I haven't used often, oodles. Life is a moment-to-moment series of events. We perceive it as a timeline, as a lifetime, as a history, as a continuum. But this is only because there's a transfer of energy from one moment to the next. And those moments happen in discretely very short, almost non-time spans. But they are discrete moments. And so when you hear things in Buddhism of, think about this. This woman has spent her whole life with this one man. I mean, that's, unless he died, and the tradition at the time was that if your husband died, you were supported by your community, you didn't remarry. That was very unconventional. So you basically had one relationship for life, right? That was the ideal. So then for Nichiren to say, you've had more men outnumber even the grains of sand in the ocean. Wow, what a slut, right? But this is not what he means. What he's talking about is her dedication to this pairing, this dedication to this man, who, like all of us, changes from moment to moment. Certainly we're aware of those changes over time. We can look back on 5 years ago and say, we're a completely different person than we used to be. But in this context, what Nichiren is doing is validating that we are moment to moment a different person. And so we have to recommit to our relationships moment to moment, day to day, hour to hour, week to week, month to month, right? You can start to understand it that way. So what he's speaking to is her wifely commitment to a man, right? Your vows this time, however, were ones made with your true husband. The reason is that it was due to his encouragement that you became a practitioner of the Lotus Sutra. So this is where we get to the point of this statement. See, don't get lost in this other mystical side of it, because that's not what it's about. It's about understanding that when they came to the Lotus Sutra, they started to relate to one another in a much more true manner, true to their enlightenment, their Buddha nature, both of them, very egalitarian. No longer are you a servant to a man. Culturally you may be, but intellectually, mentally, both of you have equal respect and are both living toward your bodhisattva selves, your Buddha-ness, your Buddha mind, your Buddha way. There's no differentiation, male, female, husband, wife, right? All that goes away. Incredibly powerful thing to say, especially when you consider the time they were living in other words. Thus you should revere him as a Buddha. So there it is again. He's reinforcing the idea that by the time he leaves this mortal coil, with all of its samsaric accoutrements and illusions and delusions and influences, he's finally fully released. And now, because he's a student of Buddhism and understands achieving his Buddha equanimity and clarity, he can experience that as he leaves this body. And for that moment, at least, just before death, he's completely released from this physical body, and he enters the mental state, which in Buddhism lingers. It lingers for a short time. And it lingers largely, if not only, because of its attachments between its existence in a physical form and its relation to the others that it communicated with, these mental entities that all of us are. And so you really could say quite analytically, if you will, that his mental processes end with his physical processes. But his mental connections are so intimately entwined in those around him, especially the closer and closer, like a wife, like children, that he persists as a mental function in those people. It's fresh. He's no longer here, but he is most recently here. And that's that transfer from himness, from ueno, to the conception of him in these other mental entities. In this case, his wife, right? So, in that sense, because the wife got to experience the end of his physical existence and mental existence, she is most intimate now with the remainder of him as a Buddha experience for herself. Does that make sense? When he was alive, he was a Buddha in life. and now he is a Buddha in death. So now this is the more profound teaching that says that we are all living in Buddha right now. What prevents us from understanding that is our delusions of samsara, our physical attachment to our physical phenomena of body and environment and so on and so forth. That's our deluded state, because we want to attach to everything that's about. We want to make that permanent, even though it's transient and just a vehicle for us to understand something much more profound, is the Buddha-ness that we are all in right now. Do you see where this is going? The title of this Go Show should give it away. He is a Buddha in both life and death. Because he experienced Buddha mental state, life condition, while in this physical form, he mentally still continues to exist, not in body or as a separate entity, but an entity within your own perception, your samsaric experience that's still attached. Okay? This is what is meant by that most important doctrine called attaining Buddhahood in one's present form. The 4th volume of the Lotus Sutra states, quote, if one can uphold this sutra, one will be upholding the Buddha's body. So there it is. The Buddha's body is simply a physical manifestation of a life state, a life condition, a mental life condition. Neither the Pure Land nor hell exists outside one's self. Drop the mic. I'm going to read that again. So maybe all my babble will gel here. Neither the Pure Land, the Buddha experience, the Dharma, nor hell, whatever you conceive that hell to be, and I'm telling you it's an experience that we impose on ourselves of suffering, nor hell exists outside one's self. So all of this drama occurs in our mental state of samsara, yours and mine. Both lie only within one's own heart. There's that heart analogy again. But what if you think about, and this may be useful, in Asia, heart generally is taken to mean the connection between our emotions, which we associate with the heart organ, because a lot of our emotions, when we feel them, seem to come into our chest, don't they? But the heart in Asian philosophies generally includes not only that chest existence, that heart includes the mental perception, the mind. So it's a mind-body association, a mind-emotive association. Once again, I remind you, Buddhism is about this bodily existence being a vehicle to our mental perception, and that the two are linked. In samsara, the two are linked. So the way we think, the way our mind works, affects our body, and what our body experiences affects our life condition, our mental experience. The two are very intertwined, right? So, awakened to this, one is called a Buddha. When you realize this fundamentally, then you're in Buddha-ness. Deluded about it, one is called an ordinary person. The Lotus Sutra reveals this truth, and one who embraces the Lotus Sutra will realize that hell is itself the land of tranquil light. In other words, this samsaric experience where you endlessly attach, consciously or subconsciously, to the physical world, the body, this is your source of suffering. But when you realize that this body, this physical reality, is your opportunity to manifest, know, and experience this detached, observational beauty of this process that life is, you slip into a mental state of Buddha, then all of this other physical reality, this body of life that we experience, is simply a vehicle for your enlightenment. When you awaken to that understanding, then suffering falls away, because it's no longer something to be suffered. It's something to be appreciated, embraced, and enjoy, and be awestruck by, right? He goes on. Where are we time-wise? He goes on. Even if one were to practice the provisional teachings for immeasurable millions of years, if one should turn away from the Lotus Sutra, it would simply always be hell. I did not make this assertion. It was decided by Shakyamuni Buddha, many treasures Buddha, and the emanation Buddhas of the 10 directions. To practice the provisional teachings is to be like a person scorched by fire who goes deeper into the flames, or like a drowning person sinking farther toward the bottom of the depths. Those who fail to embrace the Lotus Sutra are like persons going into fire or water. Those who rely on such evil teachers as Honen, Kobo, and others, slanderers of the Lotus Sutra, and believe in the Amida or the Mahavarachana Sutra, are going farther and farther into the hell, or deeper and deeper into the depths of the water. How can they possibly escape agony? They will doubtless fall into the fiery pits of the hell of the repeated rebirth for torture, the hell of black cords, the hell of incessant suffering, or sink into the icy depths of the hell of the crimson lotus and the hell of the great crimson lotuses. Crimson lotus. The second volume of the Lotus Sutra reads, quote, when his life comes to an end, he will enter the Avicii hell. He confined there for a whole kalpa, and when the kalpa ends, be reborn there again. He will keep repeating this cycle for a countless number of kalpas. Now, that's a warning. So what Nichiren is doing here is he's recognizing that this woman has lost her husband. She must feel very lost, very vulnerable, and vulnerable to what? Bad influences. Influences that will condemn her to stay in that grieving, woe is me, life is terrible, I've lost my husband. You know, she may even lead her to take her own life, right? That's easy to understand. So what Nichiren does as first is he tries to keep her marriage to her husband intact, at least in a life condition stance. And then he tells her that the main reason her husband was such a great man, that she should honor him and keep that relationship going mentally, is that he brought her to the Lotus Sutra, to Buddhism, to know her true nature, her enlightened nature. And in that way, she should see him as the Buddha himself and keep that influence in her life. So that's a very positive reinforcement. Now he's cautioning her, and he's saying, if you listen to these other people that want to now get your attention, oh, you lost your husband, oh, practice this, oh, this will give you comfort, they can influence her to fall away from the very thing her husband, who honored her life by bringing her to the Lotus, she's vulnerable. She can now be influenced into these other ways of thinking that will leave her in suffering. She will never get out of her suffering if she lets herself follow these others. And what would make her vulnerable and make her follow these others? The influence of evil friends. In other words, friends with their own agendas, their own need for social contact. See, this is what she's missing the most. Her husband's gone. So her physical social contact with others has been severed. And it is very common with especially grieving people to look for community anywhere they can find it, and often end up in terrible associations, but they don't know it because they're so craving this belonging to a social group. They can be influenced. So this part here is explaining to her that she should resist that at every cost, right? Now he goes on. Your late husband has escaped such agonies. So see the example of your husband. He didn't let himself wander into these other negative influences. He stayed steadfast, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, with the Buddha nature that he asked of you, his wife, to share. For he was a lay supporter of Nichiren, the votary of the Lotus Sutra. The sutra reads, quote, if someone, ... should enter a great fire, the fire could not burn him. If one were washed away by a great flood and called upon his name, one would immediately find oneself in a shallow place, end quote. It also reads, the good fortune you can gain thereby cannot be burned by fire or washed away by water, end quote. How reassuring, how encouraging. So this is all about using this event both as an encouragement, a steadfastness, a support, and recognizing the vulnerability in samsara that it exposes you to. Be careful. Don't let yourself be swayed. Remember always your husband, your lost one, in the highest regard. And this will support you through not being influenced by these others. You see now? He continues, after all, even if one looks for hell in some faraway place, the iron rods of the wardens of hell and the accusing cries of the demon guards do not exist apart from one. In other words, if you give these influences credence in any way, it will be you who chooses to walk down that path. You can't blame them. They're just doing what they do. You must be vigilant against being influenced by these negative energies. You can't blame these others. This teaching is of prime importance, but I will impart it to you just as Bodhisattva Manjushri explained the secret teaching of the attainment of Buddhahood in one's present form to the Dragon King's daughter. And if you're familiar with that story in the Lotus, you find that the Dragon King's daughter, which, by the way, women were not, until this chapter, women were not acknowledged as being able to ever attain Buddhahood. Until, in fact, they changed into a man in another life and then had access to Buddhahood. It's very convoluted. But in the Lotus, women are given this ability just like anyone else. After hearing it, strive even more earnestly in resolute mind and conviction. One who, on hearing the teachings of the Lotus Sutra, makes even greater efforts in resolute mind and conviction is a true seeker of the way. Tendai states, quote, from the indigo and an even deeper blue, end quote. This passage means that if one dyes something repeatedly in indigo, it becomes even bluer than the indigo leaves. The Lotus Sutra is like the indigo, and the strength of one's practice is like the deepening blue. So, I'm going to end on that note, and we'll continue in the next video. But that was an interesting statement at the end of that paragraph, saying that it's really the nature of our practice of Buddhism And this is why you know, you'll hear people doing daimoku campaigns, chanting daimoku for hours on end, sometimes overnight, when people are faced with deep vulnerabilities, deep challenges, deep obstacles, and they just don't feel prepared to understand them in their human mind in any way. They will often use this mandala, settle down in front of it, and chant and focus to enlighten their Buddha mind to navigate through these very overwhelming emotions and feelings that are this physical body life. But the point is that when we have to continue, because we're in samsara, we have to continue to recommit ourselves to our Buddha way, to our Bodhisattva way, to our Buddha nature. We have to continually work to do that, because the moment we slack off, other influences can start to meander their way into us, and that creates more obstacles for us to then get back to that Buddha way, right? So certainly after her husband passed, this woman was dealing with a tremendous vulnerability for other influences to come in. And again, a reminder, all these influences come in because of what? Because of our samsaric nature to attach to something physical, something. The social fabric is a physical manifestation of body, of self. It's an extended self, right? So we're very attached to that. And through that attachment, we can easily allow ourselves to be influenced by those things that we want to remain attached to. The world of desire. This is, you see, that this attachment, and we've been talking about it recently, but I want to point out that it's in every single teaching. All of these different ways of looking at our human situation comes from this identification problem, right? All of the sufferings we feel are from this identification, accruement, hanging on to state of being. So this is a very interesting go-show in that respect, and I hope it makes sense to you. We'll continue with it, and we'll see where he goes with this. But as always, please comment if there's another way I can talk about this, or maybe you have a clever anecdote or analogy that you can offer to our Sangha, and I will make sure that it works. And I appreciate that from you as well. Okay, so that's enough for this. We'll see you in part 2. And stay healthy, take care of yourself, keep your practice strong. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. See you soon.